Sub-Commander Lysay Torath sat in her command chair and stared at the empty blackness on her main screen. The same blackness she had been staring at for the last 47 days straight, without a single interesting thing happening, even once. The outer veil was the most boring stretch of space in the entire galaxy, and everyone in the Reshkai Compact knew it, and nobody wanted to be posted there. And yet here she was, running sensor sweeps over a whole lot of nothing, because she had made the mistake of asking the wrong questions to the wrong people about some old classified records that were apparently none of her business. Her ship, the Valith Harmony, was a mid-range patrol corvette with a crew of 32 and enough firepower to handle pirates, but not much else. And right now it drifted through the dark like a forgotten toy floating in a bathtub that someone had drained all the water out of. She flicked her amber eyes across the sensor console and confirmed what she already knew, and what she had known every single day since arriving here, which was that there was absolutely nothing out there. "Tell me again about the Solari," said Junior Officer Davin from the navigation console behind her, his deep voice rumbling through the bridge like distant thunder rolling across a valley. Davin was a Gorvathi, which meant he was roughly the size of a small transport vehicle, covered in thick gray-brown hide, and had 6 limbs that he somehow managed to fold into a chair designed for someone half his size. He was also the only person on the ship who never seemed to get bored, because he could talk about old legends for hours without stopping. Lysay let out a long breath through her nose. "I am not telling you about the Solari again," she said, "because I have told you about the Solari 4 times this week, and it is only the 3rd day of the week." "You tell it differently every time, though," Davin said with something that might have been a grin if Gorvathi faces worked that way. "And I like hearing the part about the moon." Medical Officer Cheer, who was a Palathi and therefore roughly the size of a house cat, with 4 luminous eyes and a set of delicate translucent wings folded against her back, looked up from her datapad and clicked her mandibles in what Lysay had learned was amusement. "He wants to hear about the moon because the Gorvathi oral histories say a Solari battle fleet cracked a moon in half during a siege," Cheer said in her high, precise voice. "And Davin thinks that is, and I quote, extremely awesome." "It is extremely awesome," Davin confirmed without any shame at all. But she could not stop the slight smile that tugged at the corner of her mouth, because even she had to admit the legends were compelling, even if they were almost certainly complete nonsense. The Solari were a myth, a ghost story, a campfire tale that every species in the Compact had some version of, but nobody could prove was real, because the only evidence that anything like the Solari had ever existed were some old station ruins that could have been built by anyone, and a handful of data cores that no one had ever been able to translate, and the Ashmark zones, which were regions of space where ancient planets showed signs of orbital bombardment, so old that the craters had filled with water and become oceans. The legend said the Solari were a species of impossible contradictions, who built beautiful things and then burned them down, and wrote poetry while waging wars so terrible that entire star systems went dark. And then one day, roughly 4,000 years ago, they simply vanished, and nobody knew where they went or why. The official position of the Reshkai High Council was that the Solari were a cultural myth with no basis in verified fact, and Lysay had always accepted that because she was a rational person who believed in evidence and censor. Data and things she could see with her own 2 eyes. Pause. Her sensor console screamed. The sound was so sudden and so loud that Lysay jerked in her chair hard enough to bite her own tongue, and Davin made a noise like a startled animal and knocked his navigation console sideways, and even Cheer dropped her datapad, which for a Pelathi was the equivalent of a full-blown panic attack. "What is that?" Lysay said, already leaning forward and pulling up the sensor feed with hands that she was annoyed to discover were shaking. The readings made no sense. Something had just arrived in the outer veil, and the way it had arrived was wrong, because it had not come through a fold space corridor, or a slip lane, or a warp bubble, or any other form of faster-than-light travel that the compact recognized. Instead, according to her instruments, something had torn a hole in the fabric of space itself, like a fist punching through a sheet of paper, and then the hole had sealed shut. Behind whatever had come through, and now there was a ship sitting on her sensor grid that had not been there 3 seconds ago. It was enormous. Lise stared at the readings and felt her scales tighten along her jaw, which was something her body did when it was afraid, even when her mind had not caught up yet. The ship was angular and dark-hulled, and it was not broadcasting any compact transponder codes, which meant it was not from any of the 14 species in the Coalition. And it was bigger than anything Lise had ever seen outside of a fleet dreadnought, and it just sat there in the empty black like it was waiting for something. "It is broadcasting," Shear said suddenly, her 4 eyes wide and locked on her own console. A repeating signal in an unrecognized language. "Can you translate it?" Lise asked. "No," Shear said, and then she paused and her wings fluttered once, which meant she was either excited or terrified or both. Flagging structural similarities between this language and the data stored in the untranslatable cores recovered from the Ashmark zones. The bridge went very quiet. Lise felt the blood drain from her face, and she knew that every single person on the bridge was thinking the same thing she was thinking. But nobody wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real. She said it anyway, because that was the kind of officer she was. "That is not possible," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the ship around her. "They are not real." Davin looked at the readings on his console, and then he looked at Lise. And for the first time in the 2 years she had known him, the big Gorvathi looked absolutely terrified. And he said in a voice that had gone very small for someone his size, "Commander, I do not think that is a legend." Lise tried every single standard communication protocol the compact had, and the unknown ship responded to none of them. It just sat there in the dark, engines running, a mountain of metal and silence hanging in the void, like it had all the time in the universe, and was perfectly happy to wait. Compact regulations were very clear about what she was supposed to do in this situation. Call for a battle group, and stay at a safe distance, and not do anything stupid. But the nearest fleet anchorage was 11 days away by sliplane, and Lise had never been good at not doing stupid things when there was something she desperately needed to understand. "I am going to try something," she told Davin and Shear, and before either of them could object, she began transmitting a raw mathematical sequence on an open channel. Just prime numbers, the most basic language any intelligent species would recognize. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. Responded. It mirrored her sequence perfectly, and then extended it. 17, 19, 23, 29, and kept going far past where she had stopped. Lise felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature on the bridge. Over the next several hours, she and the unknown ship's communication system built something together. A crude translation framework assembled piece by piece, like two strangers on opposite sides of a wall, passing notes through a crack. Each note a little more complex than the last. Numbers first, then simple concepts, then grammar, then meaning. It was clumsy and slow and full of gaps, but it worked. And when the first coherent sentence came through, Lise read it 3 times because she could not believe what it said. "We are human, and we are coming home." Shear was already cross-referencing the word human against every database the compact had, and she found it buried deep inside one of the corrupted data cores from the Ashmark zones. A single entry in a file so old it was practically dust. Solari, it read, self-designation, human. Lise sat back in her chair and let that settle over her like cold water. The Solari were real, and they had not burned themselves out, and they had not vanished into nothing. And the legends were wrong about almost everything, except the most important part, which was that they had existed, and now they were back. "I am going to request permission to board that ship," Lysay said. Davin made a sound that was halfway between a protest and a prayer, and said, "Commander, that is the worst idea you have ever had, and you once tried to cook Gorvathi field rations on a plasma conduit." "That was one time," Lysay said, "and I am still going." She took a small shuttle team across the gap between the two ships, herself and Davin and Cheer, 3 people from 3 different species, crossing a stretch of empty space to meet. Legend. The interior of the human ship was vast and strange and beautiful in a way that made Lysay's chest feel tight. The halls were built for a species roughly her height, but broader in the shoulders, and everything had a worn quality to it. Not broken or neglected, but used, lived in, touched by thousands of hands over what must have been a very long time. They passed murals painted directly onto the metal walls in bright colors that had faded but not disappeared. Scenes of stars and planets and faces and hands reaching toward things Lysay could not identify. And in one corridor there was a long glass case mounted on the wall, containing drawings made by children, simple and messy and full of joy, preserved as carefully as any treasure. They found a garden bay, a huge open space filled with living soil and green growing things, and actual sunlight generated by panels in the ceiling. And Lysay stopped and stared, because she had never seen anything like it on a ship before, and the smell of it, the wet earth and the green leaves and something sweet she could not name, made her eyes sting for reasons she did not understand. A woman was waiting for them at the end of a long corridor. She was roughly Lysay's height, with broader shoulders, and a face that carried lines of age and weather, and what looked like a lifetime of difficult decisions. And she had gray eyes that were calm and steady, and looked at Lysay without fear or hostility, but with a careful, measuring attention that suggested she was taking note of everything. "I am Captain Marin Cole of the United Nations ship Prometheus," the woman said, through the translation framework, which had been loaded into a small device she wore at her collar. And her voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that did not need to be loud. She was accompanied by a small group of other humans, who stood behind her and watched the 3 aliens with expressions that ranged from cautious to curious to something that looked very much like hope. Through the pigeon translator that still stumbled over every third word, Marin explained. Humanity had left the galaxy 4,000 years ago, and they had left because of a war. Not a war with another species, but a war with themselves. A conflict so devastating and so terrible that when it was over, the survivors looked at what they had done and what they were capable of doing, and they were afraid. Not afraid of anything outside themselves, but afraid of what lived inside them. The capacity for destruction that seemed to be woven into their very nature, alongside everything else they were. So they made a choice. They built ships, enormous ships, designed to carry entire populations across distances that should have been impossible. And they sailed out of the galaxy and into the void between galaxies, where there was nothing but empty dark in every direction, and they built a civilization there in the black, far away from anyone they could hurt. 4,000 years they spent out there, Marin said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were not entirely dry. 4,000 years of building and learning and raising children and burying their dead and trying to become something better than what they had been. And now they had come back. Not to conquer, Marin said, and not to take anything, but simply to see what had grown in the garden they had left behind. Lysay listened to all of this, and felt something shifting inside her that she could not put a name to. Something bigger than curiosity, and deeper than fear, a kind of awe that was not about power or technology, but about the sheer weight of a choice that an entire species had made together. When Marin was finished, she looked at Lysay with those gray, steady eyes, and asked a question that landed in the quiet between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Tell me," Marin said, "is the galaxy at?" Lysay thought about the compact, and its 14 species, and its 3,000 years of fragile cooperation, and its border disputes, and its trade wars, and its political tensions that everyone pretended were not as serious as they actually were, and she said, yes. Marin studied her face for a long moment, and Lysay had the uncomfortable feeling that the human could see every single thing she was not saying. "Then we arrived just in time," Marin said quietly, and she did not explain what she meant by that, and Lysay was not sure she wanted to know. The news reached Axis Prime in less than a day, and the reaction was exactly the kind of beautiful disaster that happens when you tell 14 different species that the most terrifying legend in galactic history just showed up alive and well and asking for directions. The Reshkai High Council, who were Lysay's own people and who prided themselves on being calm and rational and diplomatic in all situations, responded by calling an emergency session and talking in very measured tones about the importance of study and understanding and peaceful integration, while their hands trembled slightly beneath the table where they thought nobody could see. The Gorvathi War Ministry responded by losing their collective minds. The Gorvathi were a warrior species, and their oral histories went back further than anyone else's, and their legends about the Solari were the most detailed and also the most terrifying, because the Gorvathi had apparently encountered the Solari directly in the ancient past, and the stories that had been passed down through 4,000 years of generations were not gentle bedtime tales. They spoke of a species that could adapt to any battlefield within hours, that could fight in any environment from frozen vacuum to boiling acid, that treated injuries that would kill any other species as minor inconveniences, and that possessed a psychological quality the Gorvathi called the madness, which was the ability to keep fighting and keep thinking and keep being creative even when they were afraid, even when they were losing, even when any rational species would have surrendered or run. The Gorvathi War Ministry wanted a preemptive military strike before the humans had a chance to establish a foothold. The Pelathi Science Collective, who were small and brilliant and tended to view everything as a research opportunity, including their own funerals, were absolutely thrilled and wanted immediate access to human technology. The faster-than-light system they had started calling Breach Drive, because instead of navigating around the barriers between normal space and faster-than-light travel, the way every compact species did, the humans apparently just punched a hole straight through the barrier with raw energy, which was by compact standards both horrifying and incredibly impressive. Like watching someone open a locked door by driving a vehicle through the wall next to it. Meanwhile, Lysay was aboard the Prometheus, trying to pretend she was not in way over her head. She spent her days with Captain Marin Cole and the human crew, and every day she learned something new that made her picture of this species more complicated than it had been the day before. She watched human children play in the garden bay, chasing each other between the rows of green plants, laughing in a way that sounded remarkably similar to the way Reshkai children laughed, and she thought about how strange it was that joy sounded the same across species. She ate their food one evening when Marin invited her to what the humans called dinner, and a human cook whose name was Yusuf and who had the biggest, warmest smile Lysay had ever seen on any face of any species, put a bowl of something in front of her that was golden and fragrant and thick with spices and served over white grain, and he told her it was called curry. It was the best thing she had ever eaten, and she told him so, and he beamed like she had given him the greatest compliment in the history of compliments, and made her a second bowl without being asked. She heard their music. That was the thing that broke something open inside her. The music. Because human music was not like any music she had ever heard from any compact species. It was layered and complex and deeply, deeply emotional in ways she could not explain or defend against. And one night, a young human woman sat in the garden bay, and played an instrument with strings, and sang in a voice that was soft and aching, and full of something Lysae had no word for in her own language. And Lysae sat there in the green growing dark, and felt tears running down her face, and did not know why. But there were things Marin would not show her. Lysae noticed them, the sealed sections of the ship, entire decks that were closed off, and marked with a red symbol that looked like a circle broken by a single vertical line. And whenever Lysae asked about them, Marin changed the subject with a skill that would have been impressive if it were not so obviously deliberate. Lysae pushed, because pushing was what she did best, and eventually Marin stopped walking in the middle of a corridor, and turned and looked at her with those gray eyes that had seen more than Lysae could imagine, and said, "Are you sure you want to know?" "I need to know," Lysae said, "because my government is going to ask me what kind of species you are, and I cannot answer that question with only half the picture." Marin was quiet for a long time, and then she nodded once, and led Lysae through a series of sealed doors into a part of the ship that felt different from everything else, colder somehow, heavier, like the walls themselves were carrying a weight they would rather put down. It was called the Archive. It was a memorial hall that stretched the length of an entire deck, and it contained the unredacted history of humanity, every terrible thing they had ever done to each other and to the worlds around them, preserved in perfect detail, not as a celebration, but as a warning. Lysae walked through it in silence. She saw records of wars that spanned continents, and wars that spanned star systems, and weapons that could poison the air of an entire planet, and weapons that could crack the crust of a world open like an egg. And she saw the numbers, the sheer scale of death that humans had inflicted on themselves, numbers so large they stopped feeling like numbers and became something abstract and monstrous. She saw the war that had made them leave, the last war, the one so terrible that an entire species looked at itself in the mirror and could not bear what it saw. When she came out the other end, she stood in the corridor and pressed her back against the wall and breathed very carefully for several minutes. Marin stood nearby and said nothing and waited. "I understand now," Lysae said when she could speak again. "I understand why the Gorvathi are afraid." "They should be," Marin said simply. "But you left," Lysae said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. "You could have done anything, and you chose to leave." "Yes," Marin said, "that is the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard," Lysae said. Marin looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, something in those gray eyes softened, and Lysae thought she saw gratitude there, the gratitude of someone who has carried a bulge. Terrible secret for a very long time, and has finally found someone who sees it clearly and does not run. Then Lysae's communicator screamed with a priority signal from Axis Prime. She read the message twice and felt the blood leave her face. A Gorvathi battle fleet of 40 warships, including 2 dreadnoughts, had been dispatched to intercept the Prometheus, and the War Ministry had acted without full council approval, and they were coming fast. And Lysae had maybe 72 hours before everything she had found, and everything she had felt, and every possibility of peace was destroyed by the same kind of fear that had driven the humans away in the first place. Lysae ran through the corridors of the Prometheus, with her heart hammering against her ribs, and her scales pressed flat against her jaw, which was what happened when her body decided to be terrified before her brain had time to catch up. She found Marin in the garden bay, sitting on a bench beneath a tree that had no business being on a starship, and the human captain looked up at her with those steady gray eyes, and Lysae told her everything: the Gorvathi fleet, the 40 warships, the 2 dreadnoughts, the 72 hours, all of it, pouring out of her in a rush of words that tripped over each other. She expected Marin to panic, or to be angry, or to immediately start preparing to run, because that was what any rational person would do when faced with an overwhelming military force bearing down on them with hostile intent. Marin did none of those things. She sat very still for a moment, and then she nodded once, slowly, as if this was something she had considered before, as if somewhere in the back of her mind she had always known this moment would come, and had already decided what she would do when it arrived. "How many ships?" Marin asked. 40, Lysay said, "including 2 dreadnoughts, and I need you to understand that a single Gorvathi dreadnought can glass a continent in under an hour." Marin considered this with the same calm expression she might have used to consider a change in the weather. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and then she stood up and pressed a device on her wrist and spoke into it in a language Lysay still did not fully understand, but the tone was unmistakable, calm and clear, and carrying an authority that expected to be obeyed without question. "What are you doing?" Lysay asked. "Sending the signal," Marin said. "What signal?" "The one we prepared 4,000 years ago in case we needed it." Marin called it wake-up protocols, and Lysay did not understand what that meant until she looked at the sensor readings on her communicator and felt every rational thought in her head go completely silent. Across the outer veil, space was tearing open. Not in one place, but in dozens of places, and then hundreds of places. Breach points ripping through the fabric of reality like stitches being pulled from a wound. And through each one came ships. Not a handful of explorer vessels, not a small fleet of scouts, but a civilization. Cruisers came first, lean and angular and bristling with systems Lysay's sensors could not identify. And behind them came carriers that launched smaller craft like seeds scattering from a pod. And behind them came science vessels and hospital ships and vessels that looked like they were designed for construction. And vessels that looked like they were designed for things Lysay did not want to think about too carefully. And behind all of those came the Arcs, colony ships so enormous that Lysay's sensor grid could not fully resolve them, each one carrying what must have been millions of people, entire cities wrapped in metal and light, sailing through the wounds in space with a grace that should have been impossible for anything that size. And at the center of it all, drifting through the breach points like leviathans rising from the deep, came warships so massive that the Gorvathi dreadnoughts bearing down on them would look like insects by comparison. The human fleet stretched across Lysay's entire sensor grid and then past the edges of it, and she realized with a feeling like falling that she was not seeing all of it, that there were more ships still coming through, that what she was looking at was not a fleet, but an exodus, an entire species coming home. The Prometheus was a scout, Lysay said, and her voice sounded very far away, even to herself. "Yes," Marin said. "You were testing us." "We were hoping," Marin said, and there was something in her voice that was raw and honest and deeply tired. "We were hoping we would not need the warships." Marin walked to the bridge of the Prometheus and opened a broadcast channel on every compact frequency simultaneously. And she spoke not in the clumsy pigeon translation framework that she and Lysay had built together, but in fluent, perfect compact common, every word precise and clear. And Lysay realized with a shock that the humans had been listening to compact communications for far longer than anyone had guessed, learning, studying, preparing. "To all vessels and governments of the Reshkai Compact," Marin said, and her voice carried across the void to every ship and station and listening post within range. "We are human. We are the species your legends call the Solari, and we are coming home." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was softer, but no less certain. "We left this galaxy 4,000 years ago because we were afraid of what we were. We chose exile because we believed the galaxy deserved better than what we had to offer at that time. We return now, not as conquerors, but as what we chose to become during our long absence. We ask only for peace and a place among you." Another pause, longer this time. "But know this, we will defend ourselves and our children if we must, and we would prefer very much not to." The Gorvathi fleet arrived 14 hours later, Admiral Torvek Gal was a veteran of 30 years of service, who had commanded fleets in 4 border conflicts and had never lost a single engagement. And he dropped out of slipspace at the head of 40 warships, with every weapon hot and every shield raised, and then he looked at his sensor readings and went completely silent. His tactical officer reported the human fleet strength in a voice that got progressively quieter as the numbers climbed. And when she was finished, the bridge of the Gorvathi flagship was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air. Recycles. 14 hours of silence followed while the 2 fleets faced each other across a stretch of empty space that felt like it was holding its breath. Lysai could not sleep, and she could not eat, and she could not sit still. So she did the only thing she could think of, which was something so far beyond her authority that she would almost certainly be court-martialed if she survived it. She took the Valith Harmony and flew it directly into the gap between the 2 fleets, one small patrol corvette hanging in the no-man's land between a galactic superpowers battle group and the returned military might of a species that cracked moons, and she opened a channel to Admiral Torvek Gal. "Admiral," she said, "my name is Subcommander Lysai Torath, and I have been aboard the human vessel, and I need you to listen to me." "Subcommander," Torvek said in a voice like grinding stone, "you are in a very dangerous place." "I know," she said, "and I am going to. Stay here until you hear what I have to say." She told him everything. She told him about the children playing in the garden bay, and the murals painted on the walls, and the music that made her cry without understanding why, and the food that a smiling man named Yusuf made, with love and spices. And she told him about the archive, about the unredacted history of everything humanity had done and everything they were capable of doing. And she told him that the Gorvathi legends were true, every single one of them. The humans were everything the old stories said they were. And then they chose to be something else. They had the power to rule this galaxy, Lysai said, and she was surprised to find that her voice was steady. They had the power to burn it, and they knew it, and they were so afraid of that power that they exiled themselves into the void between galaxies for 4,000 years rather than risk hurting anyone. Admiral of a species capable of cracking moons. Choose peace. Then the least we can do is give them the chance to prove it. The channel was quiet for a very long time. Then Torvek Gal, who had never lost a battle, who had never retreated, who came from a species that valued courage above all other virtues, powered down his weapons. "Subcommander," he said in a voice that was rough and tired and something else that might have been wonder, "you have either saved us all or doomed us, and I pray to the old gods it is the former." One by one across the Gorvathi fleet, weapons went dark, and shields dropped, and Lysai sat in her command chair in her tiny ship in the space between 2 civilizations, and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for her entire life. 6 months later, Lysai stood on a balcony on Axis Prime, and watched a human diplomatic shuttle dock at the station's main port, and thought about how strange it was that something which had terrified the entire galaxy half a year ago now looked almost ordinary. Almost. The negotiations had been long and complicated, and sometimes very loud, particularly when the Gorvathi delegation and the human delegation got into an argument about military buffer zones that lasted for 11 hours, and ended only when both sides realized they were hungry, and agreed to break for food, and somehow ended up eating together, and talking about their children instead of their weapons. Humanity had formally petitioned to join the Reshkai Compact, and the process was unlike anything the Compact had ever dealt with, because the Compact had never had to integrate a species that was simultaneously brand new and 4,000 years older than everyone else in the room. Lysai had been promoted to that point of responsibility. Full commander, against her explicit wishes, and then appointed as the Compact's first official ambassador to humanity, against her even more explicit wishes. And she had protested loudly and at length to the High Council, who had listened patiently to every one of her objections. and then appointed her anyway, because as they put it, she was the only person in the compact who had eaten curry with the humans, and cried at their music, and stood between their fleet and a Gorvathi battle group, and lived to complain about it. She hated politics. She had always hated politics. But she accepted the position because she felt responsible for what came next, and because every time she thought about walking away, she remembered the children's drawings preserved under glass on the Prometheus, and the way Marin's eyes had softened when Lysay called their exile extraordinary, and she knew she could not leave this work to someone who had not seen those things. Compact society, slowly and carefully, and even the small things, changed everything. Their medicine alone advanced compact healthcare by what the Palathi Science Collective estimated was roughly 200 years, and the first time a human medical team demonstrated a procedure that could regrow damaged nerve tissue in a living patient. The Palathi delegation went so quiet that Lysay thought they had all stopped breathing, and then they erupted into a frenzy of questions so intense that the human doctors looked slightly alarmed. The breach drive was shared under heavy restrictions, because even the humans admitted it was dangerous, and the Palathi who examined the technical specifications described it as elegant in its brutality, which Lysay thought was a perfect description of humanity in general. But it was the art that spread fastest. Human music moved through the compact like water flowing downhill, finding every crack and gap and filling it. And within 3 months there were Reshkai musicians trying to learn human instruments, and Gorvathi soldiers humming human melodies in their barracks, and Palathi researchers writing academic papers about why human harmonic structures triggered emotional responses in species that had no evolutionary reason to respond to them at all. Nobody could explain it, and everybody had a theory, and none of the theories were quite right. But it did not matter, because the music was beautiful, and beauty did not need to be explained to be felt. Admiral Torveg Gall became an unlikely advocate for the human integration, which surprised everyone except Lysay, who had heard the change in his voice that day between the fleets. He visited the Prometheus himself, and Marin showed him the archive, and he walked through it in silence the same way Lysay had. And when he came out the other end, he stood very still, for a long time, and then he said to his officers in a voice that brooked no argument, "Any species that chose exile over empire has earned my respect, and I will hear no more talk of preemptive strikes from anyone under my command." The Gorvathi War Ministry was quietly restructured after that. But it was not all smooth, and Lysay had never expected it to be. There were tensions. There were always tensions, because fear does not evaporate just because someone makes a speech. And some compact species resented the humans, and their overwhelming technology, and their enormous fleet that still hung in the outer veil like a reminder of what could happen if things went wrong. Fringe groups on a dozen worlds claimed the Solari had returned to conquer, and that the peace was a trick, and that the compact was being naive, and some of them were loud enough to cause real problems. The humans struggled too, because 4,000 years in the void between galaxies had changed them in ways that were not always visible on the surface. And reintegrating into a galaxy full of other minds and other ways of living was disorienting and sometimes painful, and sometimes lonely even when they were surrounded by people. Lysay saw it in the way some humans flinched at crowds, and the way some of them stood at windows and stared out at the stars, with expressions that suggested they were looking for something that was no longer there. The familiar emptiness of the void that had been their home for longer than most civilizations existed. But they kept trying, and the compact kept trying, and every day was a little easier than the one before. 6 months and 3 days after the Gorvathi fleet stood down, Lysay traveled to one of the first human colony worlds, a green and temperate planet orbiting a yellow star in a system that the compact had catalogued but never bothered to settle because it was too far from the major trade routes to be worth the effort. The humans had named it Ithaca. Lysay did not know what the word meant, but she liked the sound of it. Way it felt in her mouth, round and warm and full of something that felt like longing and arrival at the same time. The settlement was half-built and full of life, prefabricated structures standing next to foundations that were still being laid. And everywhere she looked there were people working and talking and carrying things and arguing about where to put things, and laughing when they dropped things and picking them up and trying again. She walked through the settlement and up a gentle hill that overlooked the valley below, and she stood there in the grass, which was real grass, growing from real soil, under a real sun, and watched. Below her a group of children were playing in a field, near the edge of the settlement. Human children and Reshkai children together. And they could not speak each other's language at all, but they were managing fine, because children have never needed words to understand the important things, like who is chasing whom, and whose turn it is to hide, and whether that bug on the ground is interesting or scary. Marin found her there. The human captain looked older than she had 6 months ago, which Lizzie supposed was fair, because the last 6 months had been the most exhausting of both their lives. But there was something in her face that had not been there before. A looseness around the eyes, a softness in the jaw, something that looked like the absence of a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten she was carrying it. They sat together in the grass on the hill and watched the sun move across the sky, and neither of them said anything for a while, because sometimes silence between two people who understand each other is better than any words. Was it worth it? Lizzie asked eventually. The exile, the void, all those years in the dark? Marin watched the children playing below them, human and alien, tangled together in a pile of laughter and grass stains, and her expression was something Lizzie had never seen on a human face before. Or maybe she had seen it many times, and was only now learning to read it correctly. It was hope. Not the desperate kind, not the fragile kind, but the steady kind. The kind that has been tested and broken and rebuilt so many times that it is no longer hope at all, but something stronger. Something that does not need to be protected because it has already survived everything that tried to destroy it. We left because we were afraid of what we would do, Marin said. We came back because we finally believed we could be better. She was quiet for a moment. Ask me again in 100 years, she said. Lysay laughed. Not a polite laugh, or a diplomatic laugh, or any of the careful, controlled sounds she had learned to make during 6 months of being an ambassador. It was a real laugh, sudden and bright, and surprised out of her by something she had not expected to feel, which was pure, uncomplicated joy. Looked at her and smiled. And it was the first time Lysay had seen the human truly smile. Not the careful, measured expressions she wore in negotiations, or the tired, patient look she gave to politicians, but a real smile that reached her gray eyes and made them warm. They sat together on the hill, on a planet called Ithaca, 2 women from 2 different worlds, and below them the children played, and the sun moved slowly toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that neither of them had words for in any language. Somewhere out among the stars, a species that had once cracked moons and burned worlds was planting gardens and learning to sing new songs, and teaching their children to play with children who had scales and amber eyes. And somewhere in the space between what humanity had been and what they were choosing to become, there was a story being written that would take 100 years, or 1,000 years, or maybe forever to finish. But it was a good story, Lysay thought as the sun set over Ithaca, and the first stars appeared in a sky that was no longer empty. It was a very good story, and she was glad to be part of it.